how's it going? Today I want to wrap up June on the Range with a little roundup about some of the short stories, the Western short stories that I read over the month. Now, I read short stories by 3 different authors. Louis L'Amour, of course. I read a bunch of stories by Elmore Leonard, who's a really fantastic, or was a really fantastic practitioner of the Western story and novel. Several of his novels and stories have been made into films, very memorable films. He was a dab hand at Westerns before he turned his full-time attention to crime novels. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about some kind of little-known weird Western tales by a writer named Lon Williams. And those all appeared in Real Western Pulp magazine back in the 50s, early 50s to late 50s. I already talked a little bit about the Louis L'Amour stories I read in my recent book haul video. I also did a Louis L'Amour kind of dedicated video to these Bantam hardback collections, the collected short stories of Louis L'Amour. I have 4 of these, volumes 1 through 4, and I got this one, volume 2, this month. As soon as I got this volume 2 in the mail, I read a couple of short stories from it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But first, before that, I read the very first story out of this collection, volume 1, the collected short stories of Louis L'Amour, volume 1. It's a story I read before, but I wanted to read it again because it's such a good story. It's called The Gift of Cochise. It's the very first story in this book. And it's the short story that was the basis for the movie Hondo, which was produced by John Wayne's Batjack Company and starred also Geraldine Page, I believe, and Michael Pate as Cochise. Very good movie, of course. And then after the movie came out, his publisher or whatever asked him to write a novel-length version, and that became the novel Hondo by Louis L'Amour. But this first original short story has a lot of the key elements. The woman whose husband has gone missing, she's there with her son, although in this case it's a son and a daughter in this kind of mountain cabin. And Cochise and his Indian men come in. They've been trying to, attack her. As we learn at the start of the story, she's killed several of them, I think 7 of his men. And Cochise is impressed by her and the bravery of her son and puts them under his protection. Meanwhile, the hero of the story, or the other hero, the male hero, was in a kind of gunfight altercation, and the reason this woman's husband never came back was he got involved. He was drinking in this bar, this saloon, and he got involved in this gunfight to kind of step in on the side of our main character and got killed. And now the main character feels guilty and feels beholden to go out and try to protect his family. But he doesn't know where they are. He doesn't know their name. He tries to track them down, and then with a little help from Cochise, he does. Very interesting story. Then I read Horse Heaven, which was a fairly involved story about the death of a man's brother, and a man comes back to find out how he was killed. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the Over on the Drive Side novel by Louis L'Amour that I read before, but this one has quite a few different elements, and it was good. Kind of a mystery with a surprise twist for Louis L'Amour standards. In other words, there was a female villain in this. She wasn't the only one involved, but you don't see that too often, at least in my experience, in Louis L'Amour books. And then I read, as I mentioned in my book haul, I read, since this contains all of the Chick Beaudry, Texas Ranger kind of Western mystery stories, I read Rain on the Mountain Fork. And I mentioned that already in the other video. That's a very cool story. Any of the Beaudry stories are very tough, tight, and interesting kind of mystery aspects with plenty of fisticuffs and shoot-'em-up moments. Very highly recommended any of the Louis L'Amour short stories. He does a really good job with Western short stories. Then I read some of these Lon Williams, Marshall Lee Winters stories. Kind of weird Western, spooky, strange, macabre Western stories were written by Lon Williams and appeared in Real Western pulp magazines between 1952 and 1958. There appears to be 25 of them, or at least that's in this collection. Now, the only way that, short of having those pulp magazines in hand, the only way to really get a hold of those stories, as far as I can tell, is on these ebook collections from Wildside Press. Its title is the Lon Williams Weird Western Megapack, 25 stories in there. And I'll just talk a little bit about these stories. I read 4 of them. I had read a bunch a couple of years ago when I first got this Megapack, and they're pretty interesting, pretty fun. They're different in a lot of ways, but you don't want to read the whole 25 in a row. But they're very cool. They would have come out, every, several times a year. If there was 25 of them over a 6-7 year period, then they would have come out, 3+ a year max. So like all pulp stories that are in a series, best to kind of imagine that there would be some space between them so they wouldn't seem quite so repetitive. But I read The Haunted Town, Phantom Cargo, The Wizard of Forlorn Gap, and a portion of 7. Now, even though there are the accoutrements of macabre monster ghost things, for example, this town Forlorn Gap that Lee Winters works out of is kind of a crossroads between this long, spooky stretch of desert that's reputed to be haunted by the bones of people trying to cross it, and ghosts out there, and what seems to be sometimes headless horsemen riding around, or werewolves, or warlocks. These all tend to be kind of, I guess, a Scooby-Doo aspect, where they're just mostly gross, creepy people. They're trying to use these gimmicks to, kill people and get ill-gotten gains, essentially. And generally they end up with a bullet in the head, courtesy of Sheriff Lee or Marshal Lee Winters. So there's a couple other characters that are recurring. Lee Winters has a beautiful young wife who's always worried about him and waiting for him to eventually buy a patch of land, but she knows that he probably really will never settle down completely to be a rancher. He's always called on to do something for his chief marshal that sends him over hither and yon. And usually the stories start with Lee Winters crossing on his horse Cannonball, spirited horse that he is crossing through some spooky territory, has a weird run-in with something, and then goes and kind of has a nightcap before he goes home at Bogannin's bar in Forlorn Gap. And Forlorn Gap is full of all sorts of passers-through and miscreants and weirdos. And, he usually deals with them, people who are doing weird murders, or mesmerism, or posing as werewolves to try to milk protection money out of people, things like that. Not any real, at least in the ones I've read, not any real ghosts or monsters or things, which is perhaps slightly disappointing. But they're very cool stories, fast-paced, weird, kind of gothic tinged in parts, with some spooky atmosphere, and quite unusual for Western stories, I would think, compared to a lot of other things that people might have read this month for June on the Range. So I just thought I'd point them out and show some people that there are other weird Westerns besides Robert E. Howard's Weird Westerns. I didn't get around to reading any of Robert E. Howard's Weird Westerns this time. Probably should have, but I just didn't get around to it this time. I will for sure in the future or next year. And finally, I want to finish talking about some of Elmore Leonard's short stories that I read. Now, I read the complete paperback collection. There's several collections of his short stories. I have 2 of his, there are 3 of these mass market paperbacks of his short stories, his Western short stories, which were written, I think, most of them back in the 50s, probably. These are Harper Torch editions. So this 310 to Yuma and Other Stories has a pretty cool cover on it. Sorry for the flash of the light. I'm recording at night, which is unusual for me, but that's the way that it worked for me to get this done before the end of the month. Anyway, a lot of good stories in this. There's only 7 stories. A couple of them were novelettes, or novelette lengths. Of course, there was 310 to Yuma, the very famous title story that was been turned into a film in the 50s starring Van Heflin and Glenn Ford. and Felicia Farr, I believe. And also a 2000-something, 2007, I forgot the exact date when it came out, but a remake version, which is also very good, starring Russell Crowe and Christian Bale. And this story was fantastic. I'll talk about these stories in order. There's the content list there, if you can see. I started off with Cavalry Boots, which is kind of a print the legend sort of story, where how a kind of cowardly soldier ends up getting branded a hero after posthumously, basically. That's an interesting story. And Under the Friar's Ledge was also okay, a little interesting, with a slightly, I guess, kind of vaguely mystical supernatural aspect that's probably explained away with a prosaic meaning when you figure out what's going on. But it was a little obscure kind of ending to that story, but not bad. And then we get into the good stuff. All the rest of these stories are bangers. So we have 310 to Yuma, which is about basically he's not like a rancher in the movies. He's an actual deputy, or he's been deputized, basically. And he's going to take this famous outlaw in to Yuma prison. He has to get him to the train station. He shows up, and then a bunch of this guy's men end up in town, and then there's a tense standoff as he tries to get his prisoner into the train, and the prisoner's kind of looking at him like, why are you going all this trouble for this kind of money? Obviously, the movies go into much more depth, kind of developing a bond between the kind of prisoner and his escort there. It's not really time enough in this story. It's too short to get to that, but it's very good, well done, well-paced story. And Elmore Leonard is just a fantastic writer. So then we have Long Night, which is about a kind of struggling young rancher couple and some men that he knew from the past have gone bad, and they show up to kind of hide out at his place, and it's looking pretty grim until some events take a turn. It's an interesting, intense story too. And then we get to probably the highlight of the collection, and that is the story The Captives. And this is a good 60-plus page story, so a good novelette length. And I was not aware of this until I read the story. I was reading this going, man, this seems familiar. And it turns out this story, The Captives, is the inspiration, or was the inspiration, for the excellent Randolph Scott Bud Bedecker Western, The Tall T, also starring Maureen Sullivan. I believe it's Maureen Sullivan. The Tall T also starred Richard Boone as one of the bad guys, and Henry Silva. I believe Skip Homer is the other one in that. And it's a really excellent Western, taut Western, like a lot of those renowned Bud Bedecker directed Randolph Scott Westerns were. And the movie follows the plot of this thing quite closely. Our lead character is a guy named Brennan, and he's kind of, he went out and kind of did a bet with the rancher. He wanted to, get a chance to breed one of his cattle with the prize bull that this rancher owned, and he didn't have the money for it, so he kind of did a bet on a horse race. He lost, so he's walking back carrying his saddle, and he flags down a stagecoach. And the stagecoach, the guy who hired the stagecoach, he's kind of working for a very rich guy, and he's just married the rich man's I guess the rich man owns a big mine or something, and he's kind of a arrogant asshole, and he's just married the supposedly plain daughter of this rich man, and they're on their honeymoon supposedly, and they don't really want to stop for anyone, but this driver, the stagecoach driver, knows Brennan and stops and gives him a ride. And when they get to the next stage stop, they find the stage owner and his young son have unfortunately been murdered and tossed down the well. Really heinous act by 3 cruel killers led by a man named Frank Usher, who's obviously the boss character. This is the one that Richard Boone played in the movie. And then there's a kind of psycho fast gun named Chick, and there's another guy whose name I forget. And they're just going to do a holdup, and they end up shooting the stagecoach driver, and then they're going to shoot the others, and then the obsequious slimeball new groom of this rich guy's daughter says, don't do this, don't kill us. you can get a lot of money from the old man of this, the father of this woman. And Brennan's hearing all this. The woman doesn't hear it. She's in she's being held inside the stage cabin. But he talks this Frank guy into accepting this deal to get 50 grand or something from the old man. And he sends one of his men to go along with this new husband to make the arrangements. And then when the guy comes back, of course, he kills him because he thinks he's a scumbag, because the guy's trying to weasel his way out and leave his new bride behind. And while they're getting ready to pick up the money, in the meantime, Brennan, who's been held a captive, still alive for a little while, but he knows he won't be for long, and he starts to work with the woman to figure out how to get out of the situation. And it plays out just like in the movie, and it's a fantastic, tense, really well done story. And after that, there's one called Jugged, which was really good. It was about a young guy, kind of a irresponsible young rancher guy who has a really pretty and loving wife, but when he goes off with the boys he ends up blowing a lot of his money that he's made on these kind of odd jobs he's doing, or horse trading jobs he's doing, and gets into trouble with them because they're all looking for trouble, and he doesn't really want any, but he feels like he has to stand up with them. He ends up in jail, and they don't have any place to put him except for in this upstairs cell with this really dangerous, famous outlaw. And the outlaw's going to use this kid to kind of get himself out, and the kid's kind of recovering from his alcoholic stupor, and he's a little sick, but he's mistreated by this prisoner, and the prisoner escapes, and this kid's angry enough about it that he goes and captures this guy himself, and is eventually offered a deputy's job after that. That was a cool story. And then the book ends with the story The Kid, and this is about a young white boy who was raised by Indians, and he shows up one day. He's being kind of held like a slave by this nasty piece of work rancher, and another young good guy rancher, or I guess he's actually kind of prospecting for gold or something. He bonds with this kid, and eventually how he ends up being able to adopt this kid. And that was quite a fun and interesting story too. Now, Elmore Leonard went on to write several other novels that were turned into fantastic westerns. For example, he wrote Valdez is Coming, which is a great movie starring Burt Lancaster. Hombre, one of my favorites, which this last story, The Kid, reminded me a little bit of, because Hombre stars Paul Newman as a white boy who was captured by the Apaches, raised by one, and then now he gets involved with this kind of hold up of his stagecoach in that movie. A really wonderful movie, and the book is great as well. Elmore Leonard, as anyone probably knows who's read him, is just a great author. Really good at what he writes. And I was thinking about polishing off this one too, but by this point I guess I was Elmore Leonarded it out. As good as he is, there's kind of a same kind of a hard, spare tone to each of them. I did read the first story, and we have some nice maps of areas in the front here. I did read the first story in this, which is kind of again another novelette, probably about 58 pages or so, and it's called Law of the Hunted Ones, and it was also a cracking story. Basically, an older man and a younger kind of hothead recruit. They just got out from being guards at a prison. I don't think it was Yuma, but it was some prison. It might have been Yuma. And they're on their way out to just, go be cowboys. They're done with the service, and they run into some escaped prisoners who suspect that they're still, that they're tracking them, but they've, temporarily this guy the older guy knows the younger, this young quick gun who's, him and his partner are holed up in this kind of shack in this kind of rocky mountaintop area, and there's a girl involved who's there kind of against her will, and the young hot-headed guy starts to like her and doesn't like the guy this kind of dead-eyed gunny that's kind of keeping her there against her will. And anyway, The story plays out from there, and it's pretty. There's also a posse of Apache scouts, I believe, that work for the prison that are tracking them down, and we get some of their perspective on this. Very interesting, and again, intense. That's the key word for most of these Elmore Leonard stories, especially the more action-packed ones. This one is really cool, Law of the Hunted Ones. So in all told, that was 15 short stories that I read for June on the Range 2026. Again, of course, I'm counting this as an actual book because I read the whole book. And then I read one story out of this, 3 out of the Louis L'Amour 2 volumes there, the volume 1 and volume 2 of his collected short stories, hardback series. And on my Kindle, I read the 4 stories from the Lon Williams Weird Western Megapack. I also read several other Western novels, which I'll talk about in my June wrap-up video later this week. So until next time, I will check you later in the next video. Take care and happy reading. Thank you.